SLS, a triumph for human ingenuity and creation, with the goal of launching humans to the moon for the Artemis program. It is NASA's flagship rocket, and while it has succeeded in the last year, launching Artemis 1, its history is marred in delays and high costs. Today I'll be building the magnificent beast that is the Space Launch System in Kerbal Space Program, Realistic Progression 1, while also discussing some of the vehicle's history and its planned return next year for the launch of Artemis 2, sending the first humans back to the moon since 1972. Let's begin, shall we? The first part that we're going to be looking at doing is the engine section / the lower tank area that holds the hydrogen. SLS, of course, is using RS-25s, which means that it has hydrolox as its primary fuel source. And so what we're going to be designing here is going to be what is the bottom of that hydrogen tank that will then feed into those engines, and also the mount around the engines and the lower section of the tank that will house all of the components necessary to fly. So we begin with a couple of procedural tanks like you always do when you're designing things like this, and we're going to be going for our aluminum stringer tanks. Now, in terms of actual tank type, it doesn't really matter too much. As long as the balances are correct and it looks correct, it's not that big of an issue. Now, this little nub you see out stick is going to be, and you'll see this on screen, this is the kind of interface that feeds the pipes the fuel in to the engines, and these things coming out of it, as we can see here, as I'm kind of tinkering around, and you also see in real life, these things feed into the actual RS-25s themselves. There's 4 of them. They feed into the 4 RS-25s. Now, I'll admit I don't know the plumbing that well myself, as it's quite complex. However, we are trying to imitate a good look, and while not everything will be correct, we do have a good approximation for the images we are provided. Now, the SLS we do know, and we'll kind of get into a bit of history here as I tinker around with things. SLS was authorized in 2010 after the failure of Constellation and the new Obama administration making into office. SLS at that time was not really what we know as SLS today. It wasn't really even figured out what boosters would be used and how many engines, and it wasn't until somewhere around 2012, 2011 that we kind of got the SLS we know and love today, or maybe not love. And in that time, or prior to that time, we had Ares 5, which was a monster of a rocket that would be planned, and the failed Ares 1 rocket, which only flew in a very limited sense in 2008, 2009, if I remember correctly, as the Ares 1X. And that program had been going from 2005 to about 2009. While it failed, it did allow the development to continue as SLS and as the Space Launch System, and would eventually fly a good 10 years later under much controversy in terms of delay. So here we are attaching the engines. Now, the SLS uses 4 RS-25Es, or in this case it should be the Ds because these are the old Space Shuttle engines being reused. The last version was the RS-25D. They are working on the RS-25E, which will be a lot cheaper and will have more 3D printed parts, and will just be an overall better production model, as they did restart production of these very amazing engines. So here we are, we're setting up these mounts for the aft section. The engines are arrayed as a pair of 4, and they are done at the outer edges of the tank, making use of the most surface area possible. So you kind of have this kind of strut out section with this concave downwards, and then it kind of goes back into the tank up. And so over here I'm kind of trying to get a good dimensions for what I see in my images. A big process of building rockets like this is having on the second monitor, tabbing back and forth, and I've cut out a lot of that tabbing, is looking at images and sites and details and dimensions to try and get a good idea. And while it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one recreation in terms of dimensions, it is something that you're trying to aim for. So we now have these 4 engines set up pretty much how I see them in the images. and I'm pretty happy with it overall. The models are really great, by the way. They updated the RS-25 models in the game recently. But back to the story about SLS. So, over the years, it's been worked on, and while it hadn't seen any flights or test flights, a lot of the components are used off of previously designed vehicles, such as the space shuttle, the RS-25s, which flew on Artemis 1, which is what the rocket we're recreating here, SLS, and the RS-25s we'll see flying on Artemis 2 and 3, if I remember correctly. Those engines were used on space shuttle flights. Obviously, the engines that were brought back after the final shuttles that used them landed were not just discarded. They were put in museums, and then they were taken out of those museums once they believed that the RS-25s were needed to be used. They were then refurbished for quite a price by Rocketdyne, Aerojet Rocketdyne, and they were put back into service for SLS. This was believed to have saved on cost, though some claim otherwise. The point is that the RS-25s that you see on SLS are, at least going forward for the initial flights, and the flights that we've already seen are going to be these reflown engines, and we'll be throwing them away after every flight because SLS is not a reusable vehicle like Shuttle was. So here I am setting up the inner pipe work. Now, this doesn't really have any actual effect. This is just something that I like to do just for detailing purposes. And it's always a bit of a pain to do, but it kind of gives you the idea of the plumbing. And of course, a big disclaimer here, this is not how the actual plumbing looks at all. Well, maybe except for the two bits coming out at the start of the engine. But it is a kind of a good approximation of how it kind of would work in here. But do not take this. It's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more going on. This is just some cool detailing you can do to really, enhance that experience. And that's something that I'm doing here to kind of give some reality to the engine mounts and the hollow cylinders and the pipe work and all that stuff. There's so much that goes into things like this. The point is, we've got these 4 engines sitting below the tank with the feed system, feeding the fuel into the 4 RS-25 engines, and doing very well at that. So we close it up, and there we go. We've got the bottom of our rocket pretty much done. So now we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of detailing around the engine mount section and kind of set it up to a place to be ready for the main tank. As what we're designing at the moment is SLS's core stage, a 50+ meter high stage. It is absolutely ginormous. It is incredibly powerful, and because of cost reasons, it won't really have a second stage that will be able to utilize it until SLS Block 1B, which won't be flying until, I believe, Artemis 4, or maybe 5, which is still quite a few years away, as we are currently in 2023. Only Artemis 1 has flown, and that was last year in November, and Artemis 2 is expected to launch in 2024, which is next year. And it's expected to carry the first crew members, and those have been announced. And so all good luck to them. They'll be orbiting the moon for the first time since 1972, if I remember my Apollo history correct. So what I'm doing now is I want to test out how long the tank is going to need to be. There's a lot of eyeing dimensions, kind of eyeing what you're going to need to be looking at, and it's a lot of work to get right. There's the other also aspect of colors. So what you'll see on screen, and I'll pull this up, of course, is the kind of images I'm looking at. And these images are of Artemis 1 on the launch pad, and also of some of the design mock-up images. Now, a really good tool we thankfully have is that the RSRMVs are, well, very good indicators of how tall things need to be. Because we can clearly see, okay, well, the RSRMs, or the 5-segment solid rocket motors, the big, massive rocket motors that provide 14 meganewtons of thrust each, they're a certain size, a certain height, and if we kind of use them as a scale to kind of say, okay, the tank needs to go past it here, or needs to go here, or the colors need to change at this area, when it crosses that threshold near the solid rocket motor, we can get a really good idea of the actual size of the vehicle when we're designing it. And so that's what I'm doing here on screen. But let's go back to a little bit of the history of SLS. So after 2012, we saw significant development into the program. For a long time, a lot of the components in the SLS program as part of Artemis were more on the back burner than you would otherwise think. Originally, they planned to launch in 2015, 2016, and land humans on the moon miraculously, I'm not sure how they thought this would happen, in 2017. Of course, we have not yet landed humans back on the moon, and the year is 2023, so you tell me how those timelines are sounding up. Hey guys, this is me in post-production. Just want to let you know to clear up any misinformation. The original launch date for SLS was in 2016, and that was from the 2012-2011 kind of era, and they never really intended to land people on the moon by that point. It wasn't yet sure if Artemis was even a thing at that point. It wasn't. The Artemis program came into be around 2019, 2018, that kind of period of time, and that is when it got its primary mission to go to the moon, though of course that was generally always the aim, being a continuation from Constellation. I just want to clear that up and give some benefit to NASA that they didn't target 2017 for a moon landing, because they weren't even sure if they would have been able to do that because they didn't have their own lander yet. But that was the original intention, and in 2012 and 2010, around that period of time, the early 2010s, the general ideas of timelines and, oh, we're going to reuse what we already have and it'll all be okay, didn't really work that well. In fact, SLS is primarily new components and a new tankage, and there isn't a lot of reuse. Now, that's not to say there isn't really amazing heritage behind it. Of course, the RS-25s we talked about, the tankage is, quite well established. The second stage, which flies on the initial Artemis flights, is the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, which is based off the Delta IV, which is very famous and unfortunately is going to be retired relatively soon. Its last flights are coming up relatively soonish, but the Delta IV's second stage, or its upper stage, it's designed off that but enlarged to fit the needs of the program. So on screen we can kind of see that I'm going about, adding different tanks for color reasons, changing things around. Now I'm going to get a big elephant thing out of the room here. When you look at images of SLS in various forms, you're going to see that the colors are different from image to image. This is because of the spray on foam, as far as I understand it. It might not be spray on foam, but the type of material that they use around the core stage, around hydrogen stages, changes color when baked in UV light. Of course, the sun emits that kind of light. And when you're sat out in what is effectively Florida sun for months at a time, potentially, the color of the rocket is going to change. So I have decided to go ahead and pick the colors that were seen on Artemis 1 just a month or so prior to its launch. Of course, these colors are going to change. They also they also painted things at different times, so assembly photos are going to be different to actual launch photos, and so there are going to be some potential inaccuracies. But the point is, you can't have a definitive color when using this kind of insulation, because it's just not feasible, realistically speaking. Now, you may ask, okay, why is it orange to begin with? Well, we talked about that spray on the foam insulation, which gives it that color, but it doesn't necessarily have to be orange. Orange was just probably the most accessible and easy to use, and was used on shuttle. SLS actually, and I'll bring up some images now, actually planned to look a lot more like the Saturn V. It used those similar kind of alternating black and white colors with the USA on it. It used white instead of this orange color, and it looked a hell of a lot more like an Apollo launch vehicle than it actually is. So that color was really only decided on because they decided, okay, if we don't paint it, we can actually save on some mass here, and that will increase our payload capability. So let's just not paint it and still have the insulation. The reason that in the Saturn V was able to do so, was able to be painted and without any issue, and they did paint it, is because the insulation was on the inside of the tank, not on the outside. In this case, the insulation is on the outside. Now, as we come up here, we're installing another big important part of the vehicle. We're installing this pipe, which is on the exterior of the core stage. You'll see images of it kind of coming up and over. I'm not exactly clear on its use, but I'm pretty sure it's for fuel transfer or pressurant or something similar. I am not exactly sure. But what I do know is it appears on the vehicle, it's very prominent, and we need to recreate that look if we are looking to create something that is accurate to the look and feel of SLS. There are a total of 3 of these kind of constructions on the outside of the tank that feature prominently next to each other. There is this one, which we are currently building, and there are also wires, set up to the right of this pipe. And then to the left, there are a kind of more dug into the tank itself, kind of properly electrical system, where they keep wiring, and that runs along the entire length of the tank, while the other wiring on the right side only runs up to about halfway above the tank area. You can also note how the colors on the vehicle change. So that white that's all the way up there that you may not have seen, that I've placed, that is the intersection between, or the bulkhead between the LOX tank and the hydrogen tank. So of course you need an oxidizer, you need a fuel. And on this vehicle, we have hydrogen, as we talked about, and liquid oxygen. The hydrogen tank is much bigger than the liquid oxygen tank because of how volume works and how that fuel is very non-dense. And so you have a massive tank, and most of that tank is taken up by hydrogen. About, I would say, it's about 6 to 1 is about the ratio that they use. And so that's what we get here. Now we're kind of going ahead with detailing, and you can have a look in the background as we do so, but let's continue with our little history and story about SLS itself. So after about 2012, the design kind of finalized and became what we know today, as we talked about. Now, over those years, we saw development of the core stage, and we saw the development of the upper stage. But before that, we had the launch of Orion capsule without the service module into low Earth orbit for testing. Now, the Orion capsule, which we'll get to later in the video, is the premier capsule to actually launch humans to the moon. But at that time, they wanted to test it in space, and SLS was not ready, and it would have been a waste of funds to use SLS for such a purpose. So it was EFT1, so experimental flight or exploration flight test 1. My bad. So exploration type test 1 occurred, and that occurred in 2014, so 2 years after that kind of finalization of the design process. And that saw the launch of that Orion capsule and recovery, and all went well with the mission. The service module for the Orion capsule was not yet done, but it was on the way. In the meantime, SLS was testing out those, getting the engines back up to snuff, getting the core stage being built and welded, and you saw a lot of progress being made on that front. By about 2019, around that period, the new NASA administrator, who had taken over at that point, lit quite a fire under the Artemis program's ass, because at that point, it was now known as the Artemis program. It had not been for quite a period of time, as they weren't really sure how SLS was going to be used exactly. But by that point, Administrator Bridenstine used his influence into his new position under the Trump administration, and he basically said to them, hey, if you guys don't make some bloody progress here, we're going to have to look at commercial options. Whether he was actually serious about that is unsure, but suffice it to say, it did get Boeing, the manufacturer of the core stage, to get moving, shall we say, in the direction in hopes of not having to deal with competitors who were also competing with them on the crew capsule side for the ISS. With that in mind, we then saw rapid development and finalization, and in the years following, we saw stuff like the Green Run for the Artemis 1 mission. Now, and that was in 2021. Artemis 1 was slated to be the first mission. The launch date had slipped quite a bit, and the mission would involve the launch of an Orion capsule and service module to the moon into a distant retrograde orbit to test out systems in around the moon, test out the launch vehicle, and just give an overall, okay, this rocket can fly, we feel safe about putting crew on it, it can do stuff in lunar orbit, the autonomous systems work, and there's some secondary payloads which are fun as well. With that being said, with that Green Run test completing in 2021, The flight would then occur in 2022, with Artemis 1 launching in November of that year. Successfully launching, despite its secondary payloads having some issues, the Artemis 1 mission was a good success and morale boost for the program, which had seen many issues to say the least. And now we look towards Artemis 2 for sending the first humans to the moon since 1972. So let's get back to a bit of building. Right now, what we just did is we finished up the majority of that core stage process. So we've got that core stage ready to go, and now we're fitting in the two large 5-segment solid rocket motors. These were enlarged from the shuttle, which used 4-segment boosters, and were retested multiple times to ensure their capability. But the thing is, you may think, oh, they're new boosters. They're not. They are old boosters that have had an extra segment from the stockpile of those old segments put on top, so that we have a 5-segment booster now. And all that 5-segment booster means is that it burns at higher thrust level, but the same amount of time. When you stack a solid rocket motor on top of each other, it burns more thrust. It creates more exhaust and thrust capability from that solid rocket motor, but it does not increase the burn time or the time at which it runs out of fuel. So we're setting those up, and we are also setting up what are these black and white squares. Now you may ask, what the hell are these black and white squares, and why are they all over the rocket? Well, the black and white squares are for tracking, camera tracking from the ground specifically, and they are all over the rocket because NASA wants to track the rocket as it ascends for a multitude of reasons: engineering, public relations, and it just makes things easier to see from a distance. It's found that this pattern is a significant help in that regard. And so we have it on the boosters a lot, and we also have it on the bottom of the engine mount and the top of the vehicle, as well as the middle of the vehicle. And so you can really note these things out, and they kind of give you an idea of where they are. In KSP, we have to kind of make blocks and insert them in. Obviously, in real life, these are a lot more subtle, and they're painted on, but they are an important aspect and something that's obviously overlooked quite a bit. The next thing that we're doing is adding a little bit more detail. So these are these orangey coloured blodges, and so what happens is, of course, some parts of the tank get hit more than other parts of the tank. Some parts of the tank are made out of different material, and so what you find happening, and I'll again bring up the images again, you will see that the Artemis 1 launch vehicle, when it was readying for its launch, had these kind of splodges of color, of orange and reddish, and all of this stuff. And this is kind of what we're trying to recreate here, with the goal of making it look as if it was on its launch day. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put on the NASA worm logo. I'm sure people do love the NASA worm logo versus the meatball, though SLS does have both. These are set up on the sides of each of the reusable solid rocket motors. And so we are putting them there and safe to go, because they are really nice to have on the vehicle. We'll also have another NASA worm logo a little bit up further on the rocket, but we've got a bit to go for that. Finally, after completing the rest of the core stage, we need to set up the LVA, or the adapter, essentially. The thing that will transition the core stage to the second stage, or the ICPS, interim cryogenic propulsion stage. So we have set up the top of the tank. So this is the bulkhead at the top that has the tank below the liquid oxygen tank, and then above this we're going to create a conal structure that will be the interstage launch vehicle stage adapter. It's the thing that connects the very small upper stage to the rest of the massive 8.4 meter rocket. Though, of course, the rocket is actually quite a bit smaller than Saturn V. If you're talking about the core stage itself, the Saturn V's first stage stood at 10.1 meters, if I remember my dimensions correctly. Finally, going into about 6.6 meters, while the top tank here was only about 5 meters. So we've created the kind of the dimensions, and it was kind of hard to get an idea of the length and width of the adapter. The reason for this is I couldn't find many good places that used meters and also had good dimensions for SLS, so you kind of have to eye these things. But we have managed to get the kind of size that I think worked. And so now we're setting up, again, more of that shading, kind of that color you see from the ultraviolet light affecting onto the insulation. And so you get this kind of orangey red color that we associate nowadays with SLS. So we're setting up and making sure that the stage adapter looks all good. And we pretty much got the SLS first stage done. So sitting in at about 70 meters ish around there, the stage is looking beautiful and ready to go, but it cannot get to orbit on its own. It's going to need a IC, well, cannot get to the moon on its own. This can probably get to orbit just fine if you don't put a payload on it. But we're going to need ourselves a second stage, and so we'll set up ourselves the decouple for an upper stage. And I start to think, okay, we're going to need to make an Orion. We're going to need to get the ICPS ready. And this is when we go ahead and start our design for the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. And the interim cryogenic propulsion stage is how I will be designing it in a separate file. This is generally how I do my big project, how I do my big rocket, is I will design it a stage at a time. So in this case, we've designed ourselves the SLS core stage and whatnot, and then I'll design the interim cryogenic propulsion stage on its own and then merge the two together. What we're doing right now is testing. I'm testing to see if it'll fall apart or not, because sometimes it can be wobbly. I just want to get the general colors to look okay-ish. I had a real big issue in making the main tank colors not look too red. But after a quick unguided launch of SLS, SLS's first stage and boosters, I find that, okay, the stage doesn't fall apart. It works pretty well. I'm happy with that design. Let's go ahead and change up the colors a little bit, which is what I do, and then move on to the upper stage. And the colors did take a lot of work, I'll say that for sure. So with that done, we now onto the ICPS that I've been talking about. So ICPS, or the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, was based on the Delta IV's DCSS, or Delta Cryogenic Second Stage, and it's a RL-10 based upper stage that's about 35 tons in terms of mass. It's about 13.7 meters high and features one of the highest specific impulse, or one of the most efficient engines ever created, and that is the RL-10B21. The RL-10B2 is an extendably deployable nozzled version of the RL-10. So that means that it can increase the size of that nozzle in mid-flight, while in its non-deployed form it can save on height and total size, so it doesn't interfere with an adapter. However, it's quite a low thrust engine at about 100 kilonewtons. The burn time of this stage is going to be sitting at 1,130 seconds. Which is quite a lot of time, and the burn towards the moon takes a long time, a long time. Now, what we're doing here is we are designing ourselves the top tank, which is, as you may know from the first stage, the largest tank is the hydrogen tank. The RL-10 runs on hydrolox, which means hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen being the oxidizer, and hydrogen being the fuel. The lower tank, which we will be showing off soon, is the liquid oxygen tank, and that tank is going to have all that liquid oxygen to oxidize the fuel to create the combustion to provide exhaust to the engine. So I'm looking for flags here. I do have some issues with finding the American flag. There are some things here. What I'll be doing is, obviously, as we go through all this stuff, I'll be showing on screen the parallels to the real-life versions, the real-life designs, right? Of course, some of our some of it is just not going to be realistic. Some of it is going to be obfuscated or abstracted to make it more usable within the game, but I try to get as close as I can. So what I'm creating here is what I saw as kind of great-ish structure around the top and bottom of the LOX, or the hydrogen tank. And what I use for this is, again, these truss sections that I kind of embed into the tank and then color black. And it kind of gives this pattern, which makes it look similar-ish to what we have in real life, with those kind of almost grate-like features on the top and bottom of the hydrogen tank. You might have seen if I complained about the launch stage adapter, or launch vehicle stage adapter. I also complained heavily during making this of this stage. The ICPS has really obfuscated dimensions. Now we know the height and the width, but we don't know the actual dimensions of the individual tank sections. And so what I had to do was kind of go off fuel burn times, what looked right, overall pictures, and then just good old educated guessing. I just had to make educated guesses, and sadly, it just has to be done right. I would have preferred, of course, to get the exact dimensions, but that's not always possible, especially as a rocket like SLS has changed throughout time, and you've got artist renditions and all sorts of stuff that really confuses your search for these dimensions. So ICPS is quite small, as you may have realized. When we're talking about a 2,700 ton rocket potentially, that massive core stage with this relatively little upper stage, you may be thinking, what the actual hell? Doesn't that really hurt? Well, yes. SLS is only capable of sending 28 tons, which is basically just Orion, to the moon, in its Block 1 configuration, that is. And it can send about 90-ish or so tons into low Earth orbit, though this would never likely ever be done. This is just a theoretical. Because of this, this is quite underpowered when we compare it to the Saturn V's around 120-ish tons when you discount the fuel in the third stage, and it's 45 to 48-ish tons when we're talking about the translunar injection. Now, there are plans to, well, improve this. There are the exploration upper stage, which will be replacing the interim cryogenic propulsion stage on flight past Artemis 4, if I remember myself correctly, as Block 1B. Block 1B using those new RS-25E engines, as well as the new EUS, will be capable of putting about 45 tons into a translunar injection or to the moon, and will be able to put much more payload into low Earth orbit if it's ever needed, to kind of get it on par with a Saturn V launch vehicle. The reason for all of this is, well, again, cost and reusing existing designs. We're using the Delta cryogenic second stage of the Delta 4. Is this a good idea? Is this something that should have been developed elsewhere? Yes, but at this point it's too late, and the ICPS can do the job it needs to do, which is to send Orion to the moon to meet up in orbit and, orbit the moon, rendezvous with landers, do that kind of stuff. So it does do its job, and that's really all you can ask for. So here we're setting up this truss section which holds the other tank in place, with the top tank above and the bottom tank below, and this breaks the stability for the structure. I'm trying to model it off the actual real life stage, so you kind of see on screen as well what that looks like. And kind of going insane with moving around the top and bottom modifiers. It's a process, to say the least. So because of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage being so underpowered, the actual launch of SLS is going to be, or was, Artemis 1, doesn't launch into a circular orbit. It doesn't have the Delta V to do that. The second stage, or the ICPS, provides enough Delta V for the Orion to send it to the moon with a bit of a boost from the first stage. What the core stage does is it launches up and it puts the second stage into a highly elliptical orbit around the Earth, which they then make use of to use that additional Delta V imparted by the core stage, while the core stage still breaks up into the atmosphere because it's really low. It's about 30 by 1,800 kilometers. And it uses that extra Delta V so it can actually get to the moon. If they enter the perfectly circular starting orbit, while that would allow them to check out things before going to the moon, it would not be able to actually get to the moon without some extra assistance, potentially from Orion or something else. And this is the big downside of the stage. Now we're creating the bottom truss section. this is the area which will hold the engine. Now, there's a lot of controversy, at least for me, around exactly what it looks like down here. There's a lot of artist renditions of what ICPS looks like, and there's not that many good images online of a finished ICPS for Artemis 1 setup. Now, there are some images, and you'll see those on screen, but there's not a lot. And so I kind of go with my best approximation of what I see and what I think works, and that is this kind of truss section with a circular area at the bottom that will then hold the engine and connect to the tank directly. So with that connection done and set up, we're then going to put in the RL-10B2. RL-10, of course, has a long history in the US space program, first flying in the early 1960s on Atlas Centaur, as well as initial flights on Saturn 1, not Saturn 1B. And it would prove to be an incredibly successful engine, flying many important missions, including those like Voyager, like Magellan, not Magellan maybe, that was spatial, but all the Titan Centaur rockets, so Voyager probes, Viking probes, the Surveyor missions to uncrewed landings on the moon, many other military and national defense need satellites as well. So it proves to be a very reliable engine and incredibly efficient as well. This engine, for reference, can get about 465 seconds of ISP, which makes it one of, if not the most efficient, currently in use today, chemical engines. And that is allowing it to really punch above its weight, though the thrust issues do cause some problems. So now we're making this kind of top bulkhead area here, which is on the top of the tank. This is connecting downwards through the fuel lines and kind of holds where we're going to put ourselves the interstage for where Orion is going to sit. Because the Orion capsule and service module is going to sit right above the interim cryogenic propulsion stage here, and so it's going to need space and its mounting system set up correctly. But we, generally speaking, have now the ICPS colored and set up exactly how we want it to be. I do have to add in some additional flags and whatnot, but this is ICPS. This is the kind of shape it's going to look like. I do eventually fatten up the top stage because it was a little bit too short, and the bottom tank was a little bit too long. So I do make some corrections, though not many, of course. Yeah, this is the kind of sizing we want to have, and with that now in mind, we are going to add in the last bits. So the last bits for this is going to be the RCS, or the Reactionary Control System. This is the small thrusters that provide thrust to maneuver the stage around. Of course, it's going to be coasting for a period of time, so it needs to be able to maneuver itself to be able to actually point and fire in the right direction. And so this is what these both pressurant and fuel tanks are for. Now, they're commonly pictured as red in the artistic renditions you'll see on screen now. However, on the actual flights itself, from what I could see, they appear to be black, which you'll also see on screen now. So with that now added, we're going to add in the RCS, which is going to be vitally important. So the RCS should be put on the bottom, but on the sides, I don't know the actual locations for the RCS, but they're generally done near to the engine, away from the main mass of the tank, and given a decent enough control authority. They're not done like how we usually see, which is in KSP, very stock KSP, whatever, where we have modules on the outside. On these kind of like stages, we just have inlets of ports that kind of fire out this RCS thrust, and so that's what we end up having. I'm also getting the mass right. We're sitting at about 29 tons. That is underweight for the actual mass of the system, but it's enough. It's about the approximate amount of delta V need. So there's all the RCS. I put about 6 of them set up here, and those are providing the ullage, so they'll be able to fire directly to bring the fuel in the tank, settle it down, and allow the engine to reignite. Also adding in some pitch and pitch thrusters, which will be able to pitch the rocket over, maneuver it around. We don't have any roll thrusters. That's because I presume the Orion will do most of that work for it, as it has roll thrusters on it. It probably does have its own roll thrusters, but I have to look at where they exactly are, and so I just decide to abstract them for now. With that now being done, we're going to go ahead and sort out the Orion. Now, the Orion in the current base game of RP1 is not exactly the prettiest thing. And so what I go ahead and do is I download something called Artemis Construction Kit. Now, if you're looking to build a SLS without all this work, or this procedural work, it's got a really great SLS in it. There's RO configs, and most importantly, what I'm after is the Orion capsule they have, which is a lot better a model than the current capsule that we have here, the one you're seeing on screen now. So after realizing, it doesn't look great, no, I'm not really happy with it, the solar panels don't really match, I go ahead with this one, which is the new one. It's a lot more stock-alike, but it's got a lot more features and looks a lot nicer. The drogue chutes don't fit in correctly. It has a proper abort motor system, it has proper panels, it has all the bells and whistles that I want, and so we have our Orion here being set up. So let's talk a little bit about Orion. Orion was initially thought out in the early 2000s, around 2004-2005, as the successor to the Apollo capsule. Essentially, it would be the Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle, was the name that was given to it. In 2004-5, this was the original proposal, and the NASA basically went to companies and said, hey, can you design us a crew vehicle that'll be able to send people to the moon? Here are some design requirements. This is a baseline model we would think about. And you had various proposals. You had Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and Boeing and all the big major aerospace manufacturers, whatnot, proposing their versions of what they think America needs to send people back to the moon. Eventually, in around 2006, going up in 2008, we get to the Orion capsule we see today. Now, the early Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle for the Constellation program looked a lot more American. So you may hear ECM when referred to the service module of the current Orion, and that's because it's the European service module. It's designed by Airbus, and it's built in, well, Europe, and then shipped over to the United States. The service module is done in that way to save on cost, share cost, but also it's Europe's offering to get European astronauts on these missions. So there's politics and also an economical reason for it, and design. I mean, Airbus does make some really good stuff. But before that, the Crew Exploration Vehicle had a much more cylindrical tank instead of tapering down, and it was planned to use even methane, methalox on the engine, so a liquid fuel instead of what we have here, which is a hypergolic fuel, which is still liquid, of course, but it's storable propellant instead of wet propellant, instead of non-storable. The European service module would not come into being until about 2012, around there, when the MCPV, or the what would become the MCPV, which is the successor to the CEV. I know the acronyms are absolutely ridiculous. So the MCPV, or multi-purpose crew vehicle, instead of the crew exploration vehicle, was what it was to be designed as. They initially flirted with the idea of even using launches of Orion to resupply the ISS and crew the ISS. At that point, in the early 2010s, no private company had really done a resupply mission to the ISS, let alone the idea of sending crew to it. And many in NASA and in the government didn't think it was even possible for private companies to get the level of safety required to successfully launch these things. So Orion was initially saved for that. Then later on, we get what we now know as the multi-purpose crew vehicle, and the solar panels, which sadly are not circular as we all wish they would be. So here we go, we're setting the Orion up here, and we're also putting in the correct markings as they have in Artemis 1. And with that now done, we're going to attach that to the top of our ICPS. Now, my dimensions are a little bit off, or the dimensions of this are a little bit off. They've scaled it slightly wrong, because it's not 5.1, it's 5 meters in terms of diameters. But overall, Orion has proved to be a good capsule for the purpose. Its service module, however, is a little bit underpowered. Orion is topping in at around 28 tons when you combine its service module. Without the service module, the capsule stands at an astonishing mass of approximately 10.4 tons. When you consider the Apollo capsule was sitting in the more 67-ton range, this is a substantial increase in terms of mass. The European service module, however, is 15.4 tons. Apollo's was about 21 tons. So, what this means is the European service module is quite underpowered relative to the Apollo capsule and service module. This has led to the mission trajectories for Orion to be quite a lot different. This means higher orbits around the moon and also using landers which get to the moon on their own instead of the Apollo manner, where the lander was brought with the capsule and the service module of the capsule inserted the lander into the orbit, saving fuel for the lander. Instead, it's going to be the other way around in terms of Artemis. With all of the mass of the launch escape tower, the total mass is about 33.4 tons. So you really get on the edges of what the launch vehicle is capable of because of the second stage. The core stage is ready to go and do more, but the second stage just will not allow that completely. So we're setting it up, we're kind of fitting it in and merging it into the rocket, and there we go. SLS is ready to go. Artemis 1 is ready to go. So with Orion as it is a good vehicle, no doubt about that. Is it underpowered? Yes. But it's going to get the job done, and it's going to do the job very, very well. It can have 5 crew members total, and the plan is to fit, or 7 crew members even, if they go slightly weird size. But the slated amount of people that can actually fit on the vehicle is 2 to 6, though NASA will likely only ever fly 4 people at once. And those 4 people will be fit inside what is a much more pleasant experience than the Apollo capsule. Much bigger, having a real space toilet, and unlike the bags they had to use on the Apollo missions, which was not pleasant to say the least, and having a much bigger overall footprint, being a 5-meter diameter capsule compared to the 3.9-meter diameter of the Apollo capsule. It is the largest capsule ever created for the purposes of spaceflight, and has excellent radiation shielding, combined with new avionics and computers and electronic systems, is a far safer, more comfortable, and better bet for space exploration and travel. Now, I'm setting up the launch tower, and let's talk a little bit about the launch tower. Now, people who know about SLS and know about the Artemis program will know the exorbitant costs NASA has paid to refurbish launch towers. Because as you'll notice, that says Saturn Modular Launch Tower. That's because the Saturn launch tower that was used for, well, the Saturn program, for Apollo, those launch towers were kept. Same with the launch pads and the crawlers for the shuttle program. After the shuttle program was retired, they didn't just scrap the bloody things. Instead, they've been refurbished and refitted. The refurbishment cost and rebuilding has costed about $1 billion for a single platform. Yeah, it's extensive, a lot of money, and they've drawn quite a lot of well-deserved flack for it. The launch towers, though, are of incredible importance, and because of the different kind of launch compared to shuttle, which was a asymmetrical vehicle, there are needing to be some actual changes in terms of how the tail or the hold systems at the bottom of the vehicle are done, how the heights of the launch tower, how the crew systems, and modernizing the electronics and communications, all that good stuff, right? But it's still a lot of money and a lot more than you would otherwise expect to just refurbish an old tower, which was used for a vehicle that had pretty much the same technology as the vehicle you're now launching on it. But there we go. We've set up all of our attachments to the top of the vehicle and also the tail and the bottom, and we now have Artemis 1 ready to go. So what will we do when we have it ready? Well, the first thing that I usually do is set up all the staging, and then the next thing is simulate and test that the thing actually works. Because you can do all this work and then find out that the thing doesn't work. And let's just say that is actual hell when you have to rebuild an entire rocket because you just realized you wasted 2 hours of your life building the rocket. What I will say is that this was a lot easier to build than my previous attempts at SLS. I have built previous SLS rockets procedurally before, and those have been quite the mountainous effort. And by knowing what I need to do, this has been a lot easier, and also I'm a lot more happier with this overall design for the vehicle. With that being said, I'm setting up the staging now, and then we're going to go ahead and simulate in a couple of launches to kind of get an idea of the launch profile and also if the vehicle works. A lot of the time, the wobbliness of the vehicle can cause collapses or just outright complete failure, and it can be a real issue. So it's something that I ideally would like to avoid, and a lot of that has to do with improper tank placement or some weird physics situation, wobbliness of the rocket itself. It's fairly annoying, but you can mitigate it quite easily in RP1. I just put down the hold down masts, and we're going to be looking at getting the engines sorted out to the point where we can launch the vehicle. It's looking really pretty, I will say so far, and I'm really happy with the result. There's not much else more I would do. Maybe look at upgrading the ICPS or something like that, but I think overall it is a faithful recreation of the vehicle. So, let's talk about Artemis 1. That's the flight we're trying to recreate here. Artemis 1 flew on November 16th, 2022, last year. We're coming up to nearly its anniversary. Artemis 1 had a mission duration of about 25 days and went to the moon using SLS and, of course, Orion. It entered orbit of the moon in what is called a distant retrograde orbit, which is a very high orbit over the moon that is largely stable because of how gravity works within the local system, creating Lagrange point. And it was able to test out its systems and also perform scouting for the planned Artemis 2 mission about how best to handle the moon and to deal with all those issues. Because the moon is a very not human safe place in terms of navigation and various other things. So here we go, we're testing out the vehicle here, and we don't have sound on, by the way. That's because this is just me testing and voice over, of course. We will get to a real launch at the end of the video, though. So we tested out, and so far it's looking beautiful. The rocket lifts off as expected and ascends as it does, with its solid rocket motors producing 28 meganewtons of thrust. Its 4 RS-25 engines lighting up beautifully and providing all the thrust we need. Now, the actual flight trajectory of this is not working to the best, and I have to make some adjustment. So we talked about that 30 by 1,806 kilometer target orbit. Well, because I didn't figure some things out, it was trying to launch in a very weird way. And so what we have now is the rocket's going to try and do a loop-T on itself and do what is essentially a suicidal backflip. So we restart the launch, and we again try and test it out to see what the launch trajectory will be like. By the way, those are the little blue things below the engine exhaust you can see here. As you can see, the exhaust of a Hydrolox engine in the atmosphere is very clear. It's very translucent. And that's because it primarily just exhausts water vapor out, as well as the main product of the exhaust, right? So solid rocket motors have solid fuel in it, and there's a lot of additional kind of particles and solids and things that get exhausted outwards as part of that exhaust that create the massive plume we see. While very pretty, it's very bad for the environment. The RS-25s use hydrogen and oxygen, and that means that, well, when you combust hydrogen and oxygen, the only byproduct to that is water, water vapor more likely. And so you get the actual exhaust of the hydrogen and oxygen mixing together to create the big flamey part of it, and then you get the water vapor. So it's a very clean looking exhaust. This is a third test flight that we're doing to check some things, as the test flight did not go as I expected it to in terms of the flight plan. But the rocket itself is working a lot better than I thought it was, and we have here another successful, we're going to have a successful test flight as I begin to figure out how the rocket will actually work and function. Another thing is he told the rocket motors, trying to test at what point do we separate them, what point do we separate the launch escape system and whatnot. There's a lot of questions to ask in that regard. So we're beginning our ascent, and like that, there we go. So they pull down and pull back, and those solar rocket motors all go. And with that now done, I'm pretty happy with the overall result. We're doing one more flight, but this flight is going to be the final one. I feel like I've said that multiple times, my bad. This is going to be the final test flight to determine actually entering orbit correctly. So what we've done is we've attached the altitude to 200. This will say that to insert itself into the target orbit, it will end at a apparatus of 200 kilometers. Or, well, not an apparatus, but a height of 200 kilometers. And as we can see here, that's going to occur. Now, there's some issues. You may note that the solar panels just deployed. They don't do that with the core stage still firing. They do that with the second stage firing, just fine. But with the core stage still firing, there's too much stress for them to do that. But we go ahead and we separate that stage, and we push it away with our RCS, and we have a very nice separation from the core stage here. The Orion capsule and the ICPS are on its own in orbit, in its target orbit that is, but we're not going to the moon just yet. You'll have to wait to the end of the video to see that. We even deploy the engine, and I overall give it a good test. I'm happy with what we've got. We use our RCS, and I find, oh, the roll's not working, so I'm going to initiate using the roll thrusters on the top, which is what we do. And yeah, there we go. The core stage is going to head down the descent to Earth, and then what would happen is this upper stage, or the ICPS, would fire towards the moon. And fire it would do. But with that being said, we're going to get into the end of the video, and we're going to launch Artemis 1 for real. Enjoy the show.